What if one morning, entire African nations woke up banned from entering the United States, without warning, without explanation? That's exactly what happened. Not a tweet, not a press conference. Just 7 African countries suddenly erased from America's welcome list overnight. No notice. No room to prepare. Just cancelled visas, locked borders, and lives abruptly stalled. But why these nations? Was it really about safety, or something deeper, more strategic? Let's unpack it. This wasn't a speech. It wasn't even publicized. On Monday, June 9, 2025, the world didn't hear it, it had to dig to find it. Quietly, the US Department of State posted an update. Cold and clinical. No headlines. Just facts. 12 countries, blocked. No visa interviews. No travel exceptions. Just a line in the sand. And 7 of them? African. Chad. Congo. Equatorial Guinea. Eritrea. Libya. Somalia. Sudan. Not delayed. Denied. Entire populations were frozen out in silence. Their passports became meaningless. Their futures, suddenly uncertain. The affected countries scrambled for answers. But there was nothing. No diplomatic tension, no security threat, no public justification. It felt surgical, like being struck by lightning from a clear sky. Some local media assumed it was fake news. It wasn't. Even American embassies seemed unprepared. Within hours, phone lines went dead. Social media pages were locked. People with approved travel plans were left stranded, told by airline staff their bookings were flagged code for, "You're not getting on the plane." At first, the global press barely blinked. But in African capitals, it hit like an earthquake. Diplomats demanded answers. Businesses held emergency calls. Universities panicked. Students with US admissions faced closed doors overnight. Washington stayed silent. No reasons. No warning. Just exclusion. And for those who lived through it, the worst part wasn't just being banned. It was being ignored. There was no outrage. No rallies. No headlines. It was as if no one cared. People weren't just cut out. They were erased. The phone lines that once hummed with visa queries now buzzed with urgency, African leaders calling for alternatives. They'd long navigated a delicate balance between Western pressure and their own people's needs. But this brutal, unapologetic ban severed that tightrope altogether. Across the continent, shock didn't breed fear. It ignited rage, unity, and swift action. Washington expected quiet submission. After all, in past decades, African governments had grown accustomed to Western dictates, accepting policy shifts, tolerating humiliation, working around invisible red lines. But June 2025 shattered that script. This wasn't mere criticism, it sparked a continent-wide wave of defiance and, in places, retaliation. This awakening didn't come from a single capital, it erupted simultaneously across nations, as if a collective wound had finally been acknowledged. And it began with bold public statements. The African Union, often criticized for being slow or overly diplomatic, wasted no time. AU Commission Chair Moussa Faki Mahamat spoke on live television across the continent, denouncing the ban as an unjust tool of exclusion, rooted in outdated hierarchies of power. His words were sharp, deliberate. This isn't about security, it's punishment masquerading as policy. But this condemnation didn't just stay verbal. Countries responded in real action, some diplomatic, some symbolic, others with real policy moves. Burkina Faso struck hardest. Though not on the banned list, Ouagadougou announced a total suspension of US visa processing. No new American visas. All pending applications frozen indefinitely. Their message was blunt: if you treat our neighbors as untouchables, don't expect free passage in our country. This was solidarity on a scale rarely seen, Africa standing united. Even nations with long-standing alliances with the US began recalibrating. In Senegal, university administrators redirected elite student recruitment toward China and Brazil, ditching American Ivy League pipelines. In Kenya, tourism boards shifted to promote domestic and African travel, citing unpredictable external policies. In Nigeria, lawmakers drafted legislation to prioritize investments from non-Western partners, labeling the US visa ban as imperial coercion cloaked in diplomacy. Social media saw a cultural shift too. The hashtag no visa no dignity went viral. Thousands shared stories of endless paperwork, fees, and visa waits, only to be erased overnight. These posts weren't angry, they were resigned, reflective, and quietly revolutionary. For many Africans, the ban shattered illusions. They'd invested years proving their worth, visa interviews, bank statements, background checks, only to be rejected because of birthright. Their words whispered, if access can vanish with a keystroke, maybe we should stop chasing it. Universities in Addis Ababa, radio stations in Bamako, they all began questioning dependency on Western scholarships and passports. Instead, they explored Pan-African education systems. They asked, what if disciples of progress start their own programs? Build their own foundations? The momentum spread quietly but firmly. When a superpower revokes your place, maybe it's time to stop needing that validation entirely. And so, while embassies fell silent, a continental reassessment began. People started rebuilding from within. Even without buzz or headlines, millions of lives were reshaped, in closed airports, emptied embassies, and vanished flight bookings. Local economies took a hit. Hotels near U.S. embassies, English test centers, migration agents, all saw clients disappear. A legitimate legal migration industry collapsed under a single command. Even people granted visas before the ban lived in uncertainty, blocked mid-transit, questioned at airport gates, stranded by unclear policies. Airlines issued no official guidance. Embassies offered no written reassurance. Travelers were left in limbo, as if lives could be paused indefinitely. In Ghana, Rwanda, Cameroon, students began asking, why chase a dream that can be deleted unilaterally? Fatigue set in, the exhaustion of playing by the rules and still being dismissed. Across kitchen tables and cramped minivans, a revelation took hold. This wasn't just a visa ban, it was a denial of dignity. And there was no expiration date stamped on it. It made clear, you're not part of the world America is building. The American dream for millions didn't end with fanfare, it was erased in a bureaucratic click. But in that quiet void, something else sparked, the urge to build new dreams. Ones not rooted in external validation. Through Africa's dusty government corridors and vibrant WhatsApp groups, the message grew, stop knocking on doors that can be shut arbitrarily. Let's construct our own. In Rwanda, the government quietly expanded a regional scholarship program. In Uganda and Kenya, universities launched collaborative research funded by non-Western partners. In Lomé and Bamako, startups pivoted from Silicon Valley to markets in Shanghai, Ankara, and Sao Paulo. Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger drew up regional labor and mobility plans, essentially, their own homegrown borders. A decade ago, such ideas would have sounded idealistic. Now they felt necessary, obvious, and possible. African central banks quietly signed currency swap agreements with China and Russia, reducing dependence on the dollar. Youth athletes studied Mandarin instead of TOEFL. Entrepreneurs pitched to yuan, not dollars. This wasn't a boycott. It was a strategic pivot. One by one, African nations began rewriting their futures, less reliant, more sovereign. And here's the twist. The ban created something even Pan-Africanism never could, unity through shared exclusion. The pain of being blacklisted became a binding agent. Families were separated. Futures were unmoored. Dreams were cancelled like expired passports. But even amidst loss, a cultural shift took root. From Senegal to Namibia, media outlets began highlighting local universities, homegrown tech incubators, and innate African ingenuity. Billboards that once proudly advertised study in the USA were replaced with bold Build Africa Here campaigns. Artists, filmmakers, and musicians reclaimed the narrative, not as victims seeking permission, but as architects of a new future. This wasn't about begging for inclusion. It was about consciously walking away. The visa ban tried to tell Africa, you don't belong. Africa replied, we don't need to. Not out of pride, but out of clarity. Calculation. A quiet determination to chart its own path. And so the question remains, did this ban do more harm than good? Is Africa making the right pivot? Share your thoughts below. Do you support an Africa that stands independent? Want more stories on culture, history, identity, and Black excellence? Subscribe and hit the bell. We're just getting started. But beneath that silence, a different set of questions began to surface. Why now? Why these specific countries? What was the real motive? Because this didn't look random. It looked deliberate. Each banned country had something in common: a growing distance from US influence. Some had ended military deals with Washington. Others had kicked out American companies exploiting local resources. Several had recently met with Russian and Chinese officials, negotiating trade and infrastructure deals that cut out Western banks entirely. So, was this really about protecting America? Or punishing independence? Because if you follow the pattern, it's clear, this wasn't about passports. It was about power. The ban became a tool, not for defense, but for discipline. Take Sudan. Just before the ban, they signed a major port development deal with China and Turkey, no US involvement. Suddenly, Sudanese engineers and students couldn't enter the US. Libya? They shut down a US intelligence hub over accusations of spying. Soon after, visa access gone. Equatorial Guinea? They inked a $2.5 billion oil deal with Beijing. Guess what followed? A ban. These weren't coincidences. These were pressure tactics. The message was simple: if you drift from Washington, you get locked out, not just of airports, but of markets and prestige. To sell it, the administration used vague terms: identity verification issues, national interest concerns. Empty phrases. Legally meaningless. Perfect cover. Why? Because they're impossible to disprove. You can't argue against a negative. You can't challenge a security claim with no details. And that's the trap. Legally untouchable. Politically unaccountable. But there was one mistake. Washington thought these countries would beg to be let back in. That they'd fold under pressure. But they didn't. Because many were already building a future without US approval. Exploring new alliances. Creating their own paths. So what started as a quiet ban might have just awakened a continent.